Denzel Washington played the lieutenant colonel. Denzel Washington played this lieutenant colonel that was involved in a very scandalous incident during the war. And as it came about, he did not have the courage under fire to stand up for what was right. Later, after he got out of the war, he began to be a part of an investigation, and where he had another opportunity to display courage under fire. The title of today's message is Courage Under Fire. I would ask that you turn in your Bibles, your copy of the Scriptures, to Daniel chapter 3. Daniel chapter 3. Now, as we turn to Daniel chapter 3, we can almost sense in the air the anticipation of a magnificent event. During this time, King Nebuchadnezzar, the Bible tells us that King Nebuchadnezzar had built a giant statue. A giant statue, 90 feet tall. For you football guys, it's 30 yards up in the air, right? And with a breadth, the base of 9 yards, of 9 feet, 3 yards. And so you've got this huge giant statue in a plain, as it were, a flat place, a flat area in the plains of Dura. Now, Dura was about 6 miles outside of the capital city of Babylon. The mountains surround Dura. There was a river called the Dura River that ran through this area. But the mountains would have allowed Nebuchadnezzar and his people to build this statue somewhat in guise, somewhat where those from the community, those from the capital city could not see what was going on. As it was, he had completed the statue. The statue was of gold. We know that it was made of gold. We don't know for sure if the entire statue was gold. A 90-foot statue entirely of gold would have been a monstrosity, would have been a very heavy edifice that would have had to have a great base around it. We don't know if it's entirely made of gold or if it's just gold-plated. Nevertheless, this thing is going to shine in the sun. This thing is going to sparkle all around. So it's covered, undoubtedly it's covered so that no one would see it before the dedication. And Nebuchadnezzar is ready to solidify his power in the kingdom throughout the empire. So Nebuchadnezzar sends out not an invitation to come to the dedication of a statue, but an order to come to see the dedication of the statue. So all across the kingdom, men and are called all across the kingdom, the judges, the prefects, the governors, the advisors, the treasurers, the satraps, everyone that is an official in the kingdom, the empire of Nebuchadnezzar is called in. Now, the empire was large. The empire was vast. And so for some of those officials, it would have taken weeks for them to travel. So they would have got their Sunday best, for lack of a better phrase. They would have got their uniforms, their official uniforms. They would have got their headdress. They would have had everything perfect because they are under orders from the king to travel outside the capital city to Dura. And they're all to meet there. And all they know is they're going there for the dedication of a statue. The question is, what is Nebuchadnezzar doing with this statue? Why is he built this statue? What is the purpose of the statue? What is Nebuchadnezzar trying to do with this statue? It's not uncommon for kings in that day and age to build statues for themselves, to build statues to their gods. The closest in size at that time was about 60 feet in the air. So Nebuchadnezzar goes 30 feet above that. At that time, one of the largest edifices in the entire known world. Why is he doing this? Well, we've got to look back to chapter 2, right? Chapter 2, Nebuchadnezzar had a dream from God, and it was interpreted by Daniel what this dream was about. All Nebuchadnezzar knew from this dream was that he, in his dream, represented this head of gold. And so Nebuchadnezzar says, okay, I see the rest of the dream play out, that the rest of this figure, that where I represent the head of gold, and the remaining part of the figure, that a stone comes and it annihilates the entire figure. And so Nebuchadnezzar, as any king, is always worried about his power. He's always scared and nervous about losing the power that he has. So as kings do, they want to do different things to solidify their power, to consolidate their power. And so Nebuchadnezzar thinks to himself, well, I will build this grand Ephesus, and I will bring in everyone from the entire empire, all the officials of different languages and different nationalities. Now, some of these provinces out there, way out there, away from the capital city of Babylon, some of these provinces included regions that Nebuchadnezzar had conquered. And they definitely were not Babylonian, so to speak, by ethnicity. We have, for instance, the people of Judah, southern Judah. And so we have these different people, different nationalities, different languages. And Nebuchadnezzar says, I want to consolidate, bring everybody in, and I want everybody to do what I tell them to do. And if they do, then I will know that I'm in charge and that things are good because I have the power all throughout the empire. And so as it was, Nebuchadnezzar brings everybody in. Everybody arrives. Everybody shows up, and they're all right there. And they're all there before the statue. And you can just imagine the anticipation. Some of them have traveled for weeks, not knowing what the statue is going to look like, not knowing what they're going to be called to do once they get there. All they know is they're under orders to be there. And so they're all there before this great edifice in this plain, and it's sticking out like a sore thumb, and there it is, 90 feet up in the air, and suddenly it's unveiled. And all of a sudden you hear this great grand ram's horn. You hear this ram's horn. You hear the hiss and the whistle of the flute. You hear the strings of the trigon, a triangular instrument with 4 strings across. You start to hear this orchestra. And Nebuchadnezzar would have had the grandest orchestra. And you start to hear all these sights and sounds, and something's going on. Anticipation is building. And you see this great grand statue. It's so bright you can barely look at it because it's blinding, because the sun is bouncing off of the gold, and it's hard to even look at it. And you're standing there, and you're bowing down almost already because of its breadth and how large it is and how bright it is. And then you're hearing these sights and these sounds, and everything is going on. And then the herald who was hired, and the herald who was there because he had a great grand voice and a great ability to pronunciate, would have said in Aramaic, a language that all the people there would have been able to understand. He says, hear ye, hear ye, hear ye. You have to bow down. When you hear the sound of the orchestra, when the music begins to play, all of you must fall face down and worship this statue. This is what you're here for. You're all here to worship and obey the king and do what he said, and the king has said to worship the statue. Hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of people. Most scholars believe up to 800 people gathered there, officials from across the entire empire, there to bow down to the statue and to obey King Nebuchadnezzar. And it all goes well, very well. Everyone bows down except for 3. And we come to the title of our message, Courage Under Fire. Beginning in verse 8 of Daniel chapter 3. Some Chaldeans took this occasion to come forward and maliciously accuse the Jews. To maliciously accuse the Jews. They said, verse 9, to King Nebuchadnezzar, "Oh, may the king live forever. You as king have issued a decree that everyone who hears the sound of the horn, the flute, the zither, the lyre, the harp, the drum, and every kind of music must fall down and worship the gold statue. Whoever does not fall down and worship will be thrown into a furnace of blazing fire. Now there are some Jews you have appointed to manage the province of Babylon, namely Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. These men have ignored you, the king. They do not serve your gods or worship the gold statue you have set up." So immediately, these 3 young men, from the ages of 18 to 22, these 3 young men, these young Christians, these young Christians, these young believers in Jehovah God, these young men of God were here, standing with everyone else before this great statue. And everyone else bows down except for those 3. And they stick out like a sore thumb. And the Chaldeans, the wise men who Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego had taken their place in the kingdom as wise men of King Nebuchadnezzar and as head of that group of men, The people who they have taken their place and occupation, they come and rush to the king. They rush to the throne. And they make 3 accusations against these Jewish men. They say, "O king, you are king, and these people have not even given you respect." Notice there that they have 3 accusations. Look in verse 12 of Daniel chapter 3. "These men have ignored you." That's not true. But they make the accusation. These men have ignored you. They have not paid attention to you. These men were actively involved in the king's service. They had paid attention. So the first accusation is absolutely false. These men have ignored you, king. Secondly, they do not serve your gods. That is true. These men belong to a greater God. They did not serve the Babylonian gods. Thirdly, king, they have not worshiped the gold statue that you have set up. They did not bow down to the 90-foot statue that you have established, and they are doing what everyone else is not doing. They are not bowing down and doing what you said. They are not obeying you. And so the implication is, king, they need to be punished. So you had 2 great Ephesus there. You had 2 great pieces of construction. You had the 90-foot statue, and you also had this grand furnace that was just blazing with fire. And it was set up right by this statue as a way of enticing people. You either bow down or you're going to be tossed in this burning fire. And the way that it has, that we see later in the story, is that Nebuchadnezzar is able to look and go down and look in, and you know the story, and look in and see the 3 men, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, walking around, and he sees a 4th man in there as well. So that lets us know that he can see into the furnace. Most scholars believe that with archaeological digs and finds that during this time that these furnaces that were built were not uncommon to kings as a form of punishment, but that these furnaces, they had an opening at the top and then an opening at the side. Well, it was there to encourage people to bow down, and Daniel's friends Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego refused to bow down. Verse 13, "In a furious rage, Nebuchadnezzar gave orders to bring in Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego." The king Nebuchadnezzar is past mad. He is furious. And we see this all throughout King Nebuchadnezzar's career here in Scripture, that he is unable to control his anger. He just loses it and flies off, and he has these grand orders. All of a sudden he loses it, and he says, "Kill all the wise men," in chapter 2. He cannot control his anger, and here he is so mad, he says, "Bring these men before me." So the men were brought before him. Verse 14, Nebuchadnezzar asked them, "Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, is it true that you don't serve my gods or worship the gold statue I have set up?" Verse 15, "Now, if you're ready, when you hear the sound of the horn, the flute, the zither, the lyre, the harp, drum, and every kind of music, fall down and worship the statue that I made. But if you don't worship it, you will immediately be thrown into a furnace of fire. And who is the God who can rescue you from my power?" Nebuchadnezzar is giving them another chance. The time of worship, the time of dedication would have continued over and over and over. Periodically, the music, the orchestra would have come back together, and on cue, they would have begun to play, and everyone again would fall down and worship this image. And Nebuchadnezzar looks at Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and he says, "Next time you hear it, you better fall down and you better worship the statue that I have made. You better do it, and if not, I'm throwing you into the fire." To which Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego reply to the king in verse 16, "Nebuchadnezzar, we do not need to give you an answer to this question. If the God we serve exists, then he can rescue us from the furnace of blazing fire. And he can rescue us from the power of you, the king. But even if he does not rescue us, we want you as king to know that we will not serve your gods or worship the gold statue that you have set up." So King Nebuchadnezzar and all his power and glory, bringing in over close to 800 officials in this setting, sending out orders, lines of communications, and saying, hey, you will leave from 2 weeks away. You will leave that province. You will wear your best. You will be here for the dedication of the statue. You will be here. And hundreds upon hundreds of men and their families in great power of themselves throughout the kingdom, they say, yep, we will be there. We're there. We're coming. And they're all there. And then King Nebuchadnezzar says to a herald, you will bow down when you hear the music. And yep, they all bow down. Everyone. These are grown men. And they know that if they don't do this, that King Nebuchadnezzar will exert power and throw them into the fire, and they will burn up and die, and all their families will be left destitute, and their wives and their children will have no one to lead them, to take care of them. They will all be gone. It will all be over. So all of these grown men, all of these officials, hundreds upon hundreds, they say, yeah, we'll drink the Kool-Aid, we'll do what you tell us to do, and we're bowing down. Except for three. And these three, I'm sorry, it is just so almost comical. These three, they say, listen, we don't even have to give you an answer, King. We ain't doing this. And they give a reason why. They say, our God can save us from this fire, and he can save us from you. And because we have such trust and such a phenomenal relationship with Yahweh, we're not serving your gods, and we are without a doubt not serving you. Now, you've been to enough vacation Bible schools, you've been to enough Sunday schools, you've heard enough sermons preached on this text to know the remainder of the story. You think Nebuchadnezzar was mad before? I mean, he is really mad now. He says, fire it up, boys. Fire this furnace up 77 times. Fire it up 7 times hotter than it is now. That, of course, being perfection. You get it as hot as you can get it. And he turns to Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and he says to them, what? We're going to find out if your God can save you. You want to go for it? You want to have a showdown? We're going to find out if your God can save you. And so he tells his strongest soldiers. The Bible says that he takes the strongest soldiers and they go and they grab. They don't take time to disrobe them. They take them in their uniforms, their headdress, everything about them. They bound them up and they walk up to the furnace and they start to throw them in. And it's so hot. It's so hot. Has anybody here been burned before? It's so hot that the soldiers that are escorting Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego to the furnace, they die. They're dead. And something at this point should have already begun to click in Nebuchadnezzar's mind. Something's going on because my soldiers are dead that close, and they're not. Well, as it were, as you read the Bible, you can visualize it. So they're carrying these men who are bound, mind you, and as they die, the soldiers let go, and so then Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego naturally fall into the furnace, and they're bound. And Nebuchadnezzar's going to win. Everybody's bowing down to who he says to bow down that day. And those 3 who haven't are now burned up, and we found out who's really in charge. Nebuchadnezzar has consolidated his power. Everybody's on board. Life is good, and he is the greatest king unequivocally across the world at this time, and it's all good. But it's not. It's not ungood. Because Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego are what? They're walking. And they're not tied up. And Nebuchadnezzar looks down and he jumps up. Now, kings do not do this. This is very undignified in Semitic cultures for a king to jump up. He jumps up from his throne and he runs down there and he looks back to his council and he says, didn't we put 3 men in there? Yes, you're correct, King. There's 4. I see 4. And they're walking around and they're not even tied up anymore. And his mind and everything he knows and his senses are flat out blown. Something amazing is going on. And he yells at Shadrach, Meshach, Abednego, come out of there. No problem. And they walk out. And Nebuchadnezzar, because he doesn't trust his own psyche and his own senses, gets all the prefects and the satraps. He gets everybody around, and they examine. That's the world's answer to the things of God. We've got to examine this. We've got to put this to the scientific model. We've got to figure this out. And they examine. And they examine Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. In verse 27 says, they saw that the fire had no effect on the bodies of these men. Specifically in three ways. They observed, these guys are geniuses, right? So watch what they do. They said, we've observed that not a hair of their heads was singed. That lets us know they're young. They still have their hair, right? Not a hair of their heads was singed. Secondly, their robes, their uniform, their dress, their official dress was unaffected. And thirdly, there was no smell of fire on these guys. Something amazing has happened. Before we look at the main overarching takeaway from this story, this message from God, I want us to go back to Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. I want us to examine their courage under fire, if you will. I want us to really think about their decision to stand before the most powerful man in the universe and say no. What led them to have that kind of courage? I want you to ask yourself, put in that same position today, would I say no? Would I justify the decision? Would I say no and say something of the sort? Well, I'll bow down this time, but we need to talk about this and let's analyze this later. Or maybe you don't even say that. Maybe you say, yep, yes, sir, I'll bow down. And in your mind, you're thinking, I'm going to live to see another day. I've got my family to take care of. I've got other things, responsibilities. God wants me to live, so I'm going to say yes. I'm going to bow down this. I'm not really going to meet it in my heart. I'm going to bow down and serve the gods of this world and do what the king of the pagan king wants me to do. I'm going to do it. I'm going to live to see another day, and then I will be like a secret agent behind the scenes for God, and I will orchestrate justice and kindness, and I will be here as a representative of God. But yeah, I'm going to bow down right now. Could you see yourself making that kind of argument? Are you ready to go? Are you ready to? Are you Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego? Who are you? Ask yourself that question. Would I have the courage under fire to say, hey, my God can save me, but if he doesn't, so be it. I am not bowing down to your gods, and I will not worship this statue. What would you do? You see, an amazing aspect of their response here, and it's not just black letters on a page. I mean, it really indicates the character of these three young men, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Look at the calmness in which they reply. Verse 16. Nebuchadnezzar, we do not need to give you an answer to this question. They're not being smart aleck. They're not being arrogant in their faith. They're just being sincere and genuine. These words bring out the nerve of these young men. They're not shaken. I'm sure they're scared of fire just like everyone else. But in this moment, they have courage under fire. They're cold-blooded. They know exactly who they are, and they know exactly who they pay homage to. They know exactly who God is. And Nebuchadnezzar is not God, nor are his false Babylonian gods real gods. So what gives them that courage? Well, here's the key. Here's an equation that I've found true in my life. And here's an equation that we see all the way throughout the Bible. Trust plus obedience equals courage. Trust plus obedience will result in courage under fire. You see, this wasn't a new thing for Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. They didn't have to muster up this courage all of a sudden that flipped a switch and then something inside of them just came out. You know, there's a lot of study, a lot of psychologists and people study these modern day heroes. What made this Congressional Medal of Honor recipient, what made him different than the other people? Why did he choose to do this and where other people shrinked back and didn't have courage? And they'll say, well, he was brought up this certain way. It was the culture which he was brought up in, or maybe it's his genetics. Maybe there's just something in him or in her that produces this at this time. What brings about that? Well, undoubtedly, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, they had good genetics. We know that because we know that Nebuchadnezzar put on his man to take these specific men from Judah because they were good looking, they were sharp, they were intelligent, they were the cream of the crop. They had good genetics, but that's not what gave them the courage to say no to the most powerful man in the world at that time. Maybe they had a good family. I'm sure they did. I'm sure they were part of a family, seeing how they worship God and how they did things in chapter 1 and chapter 2 and now in chapter 3. Lets us know they probably had a sincere, godly family, some of the few in Judah at that time. Is that what gave them the courage? No. It's because they understood first who their God is. They understand that here is a God that is in absolute, complete control and knows everything because he is the God, Jehovah God. And they had a relationship with God. You see, listen close. Somewhere along the line, it wasn't just their parents' faith. It was their trust in Jehovah God. It wasn't just because mom and dad sacrificed and worshiped Yahweh. It was because they embraced and trusted Yahweh. They had a trust and a relationship with him. And not only that, added to that was their obedience. You see, a lot of believers, a lot of men and women of God, they stop at the trust. They stop at the trust part of the equation. And so when they do come in fire, they walk away as cowards. They give in to the world. They give in to situations. And they can't do it because they've had the trust. They belong to God. They belong to Christ. But they've never put that trust into action. And they never obeyed. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego made a habit of obeying God. Consider chapter 1. They obeyed God in the little things. I think I'm just going to reveal this. A few weeks ago, we had a dinner in our home for the mission team. And I can't remember what we were doing. We did some kind of meal or whatever. But it was a church-sanctioned event, to be real formal. And so we came up here and I got a big jar of jalapenos and a thing of Cholula hot sauce. And I took it out of the fridge and took some plates and stuff like that and took it back to the house and we had that. And then after the party, after the mission trip meeting and party and everything, I put the Cholula and the jalapenos back into the refrigerator. And I did that to keep them cold so I can take them back to the church and everything like that. The next day, Miranda made a pot of chili and we're having Frito pie. We're out of jalapenos. I love jalapenos on my Frito pie. I have an ethical decision to make. As small amount as those jalapenos are, maybe not even a hundredth of a penny a piece, I have an ethical decision to make. Those jalapenos are not my jalapenos. Those belong to the people of God. Those are God's jalapenos. Now, they're all God's jalapenos. I know that, right? You're like, we didn't come here to talk about jalapenos. Well, yeah, stay with me, okay? I made a decision. I'm not putting those jalapenos on my Frito pie because they do not belong to me. Those are not mine. flashback to chapter 1, where Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego said, we're not eating that stuff and we're not drinking your wine because that is not who we are. We obey God even in our diet. And it might seem a small thing not to eat a jalapeno on a Frito pie. And it might seem a small thing for Nebuchadnezzar in his court. Maybe they laughed at these young men and these boys, but these boys and young men didn't care because they were going to do the right thing. They trusted God and they were going to obey God, and they did this day in and day out. They did it in chapter 1. In chapter 2, they've got to use something. Something's going on. Nebuchadnezzar have this dream, and so they trust God and they have a prayer meeting. They say, God, you can reveal all things. God, please reveal this mystery to us. God delivers. They trust Him. They obey Him by praying and going to Him instead of going to the idols. They ask Him and God delivers. And here they are standing before this flaming fire, furnace of fire, and hundreds of other people saying, just bow, bow and live to see another day. Just bow. Do what the world says. Do what Nebuchadnezzar says. Just bow, man. Just bow. And they say, no, we're not bowing. Trust plus obedience has resulted in courage under fire. Do you trust God completely and unequivocally? Do you trust God enough to obey Him with jalapenos, with 10% of your finances off the top, with your best time, with being a part of His church and gathering together with believers like He said to? Do you trust God enough to obey Him? Those that trust and know Him obey Him. And when the guys with the guns come and knock on your door and say, do you really believe? You're ready and say, yeah, do what you may. Shoot me if you have to. But I'm not worshiping your God, and I'm not worshiping you. I belong to the one and true God. Remember Columbine? Just a few years ago in the grand scheme of things. Columbine, Eric Harris points that gun in her face and says, renounce your faith in Jesus Christ and I will let you live. Years ago, I was at First Baptist, Wichita Falls. First Baptist, Wichita Falls, Dr. Robert Jeffress is the preacher there. He's now the preacher at First Baptist, Dallas. He's on Fox News all the time. He was there. He brought in the parents of this young lady. They showed on transparencies up on the screen journal articles from 2 weeks before her last breath of her saying, God, I know you're doing something very significant in my life. I don't know what it is, but whatever it is, I will trust you. A teenage girl, not some seasoned pastor that's been a pastor for 40 years, or not. A teenage girl says, God, I know that you're doing something profound. I saw the words, I saw the rose with the drop of blood that she had drawn right by the journal entry. 2 weeks before, Eric Harris put a gun there and said, renounce Jesus Christ and I'll let you live. And she says, how could I ever renounce Jesus Christ? And in a minute, she's in eternity with Jesus Christ. Courage under fire. Because 2 weeks before, she knew and trusted God and she obeyed Him to the day of her death. Do you trust Him enough to obey Him in all things, that when that hour and that trial comes for you, when the doctor says, I'm sorry, it's malignant and it's spread and there's nothing more we can do, do you have enough trust and enough obedience built up that you look at this doctor and you say, fine. My God can heal me of this. But even if He doesn't, I'm not giving up my faith. You see, Daniel chapter 3 is real-time stuff, man. Like, these are truths and principles that play out in our daily ongoings of life. We were never meant to just live humdrum lives. The life of a Christian, of a believer, a child of God is a grand adventure. Now, let's move quickly. And this adventure is not just about Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and it's not just about you, and it's not just about me. It's about something far greater than you and I and Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Let's look at the remaining of the story and pull out the overarching theme of the schematic of the story, and we'll go home. So what happens? He throws them into the fire, and they're not burned. And there's a fourth figure, a fourth man walking around in the fire, and they're all unharmed. And Nebuchadnezzar, with his pagan background, says, the fourth one looks different, right? He says the fourth one, the end of verse 25, the fourth one looks like a son of the gods. He's so, as if Nebuchadnezzar has ever seen a son of God. But he has now. And Nebuchadnezzar's looking and he sees something different about this fourth man. There's a great discrepancy. Some scholars, of course, say this is an angel. Perhaps this is Gabriel. Some scholars say perhaps this is Christ, the pre-incarnate Christ. I don't know. We don't know for sure. I do believe this is pre-incarnate Christ. I believe this is the same pre-incarnate Christ that we see with Abram at the Oaks of Mamre, that we see with Joshua, the captain of the Lord of hosts, the captain of the Lord's army, perhaps even with Elijah at the bent tree as he feeds Elijah and gets him ready for another day. I do believe this is the pre-incarnate Christ leading up to getting closer and closer to the incarnation. Daniel being a pre-Christological figure of someone who's standing true for God's people, and someone who is an example, and someone who brings help, salvation, deliverance. I do believe this is pre-incarnate Christ. But even if it's just an angel, God is teaching us something in this. And God is teaching his people and the hundreds and hundreds of other people that are gathered there. Remember, all the different people, all the different nations, all the different languages are there. And this is in broad daylight public. It's interesting enough, very ironic, that while all this is going off, and the sun, God's son, mind you, is beating off this golden figure and glimmering and shimmering, almost blinding people, that the God is overshadowing the glimmer of this 90-foot statue. God's doing an amazing thing. So God has sent a deliverer. God has sent salvation. God has sent rescue to his people. And God is reminding them, the Jewish people, that even though they're being disciplined, even though they're in a foreign land, even though they walk through the valley of the shadow of death, even though they walk in fire itself, God tells his people, I will never leave you or never forsake you. God never, ever, across the breadth of Scripture, never, ever promises that you will not go into the fire and trials of life. But God absolutely promises you that when you're in the fire and the trials of life, I will be there with you. So that's what helps us to understand and to have courage under fire. When the finances aren't there, when the health fades, when our relationships are broken, when things don't go as we planned, we trust the God who has always been faithful. We obey the God who has always been faithful. And we have the courage and strength to face any fire that's thrown at us. Will you, this week in your life, display courage under fire.